I think it depends on what style of training they're doing on how you're going to taper the person. If they've done a long program that's block style, conjugate, they're probably going to need like a 3 to 4 week taper. And then if they're doing concurrent style programming, then that's where I would drop their volume through the floor for about 2 weeks and keep their intensity real high, and they're going to be ready to go. You're listening to Barbell Logic, brought to you by Barbell Logic Online Coaching, where each week we take a systematic walk through strength training and the refining power of voluntary hardship.
Welcome back to Barbell Logic, and welcome back to another episode of the M.E.D Masterclass. This is session number 7, and today we're going to talk about peaking or tapering for a meet or other athletic performance. So we're going to listen to Professor Matt talk a little bit about advanced training, about conjugate and concurrent method training, and then bring that back around to the concept of tapering or peaking and explain how we're going to do that in the context of the M.E.D method that we've laid out over the last 6 episodes. Now, we've done some episodes already about concurrent and conjugate training. You can go back and listen to episode 235 for a detailed discussion on that. We've also done some episodes in the past on preparing for your first strength meet. So if you are preparing to peak for your very first meet, you might want to go back to those episodes. That is episode number 49, prepping for your first meet. And then there's also an episode called Meet Day. That's episode 51, talking about the actual day of the meet, how to handle that, some kind of tips to make sure you do your best and stay calm and collected. So if you want to hear more, go check out those episodes. But in the meantime, without further ado, let's listen to Masterclass number 7.
So the first thing I wanted to talk about before we actually get to the discussion of tapering or peaking is I want to talk a little bit about a discussion that in the podcast, Scott and I have noted that all roads eventually lead to either block or DUP. And that's true. I actually agree with that. I think that if someone trains long enough, they get advanced enough, they don't get hurt, or they don't get injured, which all of those are like massive ifs, no matter how many people you train, even if you focus on competitive athletes, the vast majority of those people are probably never going to get to the point where they're a truly advanced lifter when it comes to programming, right? So they may be super strong, but not necessarily really advanced when it comes to programming. However, if they do get to that spot, then everybody's eventually going to get into something that looks like block training or DUP training. We haven't talked about DUP yet, and we will a little bit in next week, the last week. But a better way to say that, do you guys know the difference between concurrent and conjugate training? Those are terms that have both come on. Really, I think they've been just sort of translated into English by what was originally Russian terms, Soviet, from the old Soviet Union. So what is the difference between conjugate and concurrent?
One coach asked if they were really just the same thing.
Nope. Louis Simmons thinks they are. That's why I think it's important for us to have this conversation. And so there's a lot of bad misinformation out there about it. The Soviets definitely understand that they're not the same thing. The Soviets were the first to use conjugate style training. And at that time, and we're talking about like in the 70s, right? And again, some of this is what we can piece together because we're in the middle of the Cold War and they didn't share all their secrets with us then. But what we can put together by there was a published journal called the Soviet Sports Review. For any of you who are in college or have access to a university library, the Soviet Sports Reviews are awesome. You can get your hands on them. You can still find some online, and there's a guy, his name is Bud Charniga. I think it's Charniga, translated a lot of the old Soviet sports reviews into English. So these are sort of like the strength and health magazines. You guys ever seen the old Bob Hoffman strength and health magazines? That's what Bill Starr and Suggs were the at different points were the editor in chiefs for. That was like the strength magazine, right? So while Joe Wader here in the US was really focusing on aesthetics and bodybuilding, the Soviets were putting out this sort of sports journal that was about performance-based training. It was called the Soviet Sports Review. And those guys came out with, they were doing conjugate style training. And so what is that? It doesn't just mean exercise selection or exercise rotation. In conjugate training, you might be training multiple facets at the same time, but you're focusing really on one facet of training. I'm really focusing on improving strength or improving power or improving work capacity or improving hypertrophy while doing my best to maintain all of the other ones. Does that make sense? So like, I don't want to, and we know from what we know about the body and the way the body works, I don't want to atrophy and get smaller and smaller and smaller while I'm trying to get stronger. But I also recognize that if I'm really trying to push strength gains and I'm doing triples and doubles and singles, I might be getting significantly stronger. I might be training my neuromuscular system, my motor pathways, all of those sorts of things, but I'm probably not getting lots bigger during that time period. But it doesn't mean that I want to get smaller, right? So what Conjugate did was Conjugate is block training. Block training is Conjugate. And the first guy that I know of that did that, his name was Anatoly Bondarchuk. And he was actually the strength coach and throwing coach for shot put for the Soviet international team, Anatoly Bondarchuk. And he looked at, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to train, I'm going to go back to the specificity thing. We're going to train lots of different exercises as we're far out from a competition. We're going to train lots of different exercises, lots of general exercises, not specific exercises. And we're going to try to focus on different physical adaptations or a specific physical adaptation. Like I'm going to try to get my guys improve their work capacity and hypertrophy in the first block. I'm going to try to improve pure raw strength in the second block. I'm going to try to improve power in the third block. That would make sense, right? For a thrower. So Conjugate starts very general, and over the course of the training cycle becomes more and more specific. And so what you would see the Russians do is they would do lots of different exercises. They would do good mornings, and they would do all kinds of different squats, and they would do all kinds of different, a lot of times maybe these guys were the Olympic weightlifters, and so they would do different styles of the lifts. They do power cleans and hanging power cleans and hanging snatches and snatches from blocks and whatever, right? And they would do that with all the lifts or whatever they were aiming to compete for. And then as they get closer and closer to the competition, they get more and more specific with their training. So again, it depends on whether they're a power lifter, whether they're an Olympic weightlifter, whether they're a shot putter, a thrower. At the point that I'm shot putting, then the volume and frequency of the shot that I'm going to throw, it's going to take precedent as I get closer and closer to a shot put type competition. And the actual really heavy lifting is probably going to get a little less and less. I'm going to try to get the biggest bang for my buck. I'm probably going to do some quick, heavy power movements like power cleans and things like that, where I'm just trying to put a lot of power into the floor. So that's Conjugate, right? So Conjugate is I'm training really one facet at a time. Each one builds off the previous one. So that's Conjugate. Now, what's Concurrent? Training multiple attributes simultaneously. And this discussion is going to matter when we get to the taper. I promise there's a reason that we're having this. And I don't want to just focus on the theoretical, although I also want to be clear. I loved theory classes in college. Like I liked the theory because it forced me to then think about how to apply it practically to whatever it was that I was doing, right? And so it's kind of the same thing here in training. So Concurrent is we're going to train this several or even potentially many physical attributes at the same time. And so the primary type of training that Conjugate uses is what we call block training. You have little blocks. It's called block because you have little blocks of time. Those little blocks of time are usually, they could be as short as like a week. They're usually going to be 2 weeks to 4 weeks. And they could be as long as 8 weeks for a block. But there's going to be a period of time that is a block where I'm going to work on a specific thing while doing my best to try to not let the other ones get worse or much worse. So I'm going to try to maintain most of those physical attributes, and I'm going to build one specific one. And then I'm going to get to the next training block. I'm going to transition into the next training block, and I'm going to try to build a different attribute while maintaining the stuff that I had built in the first one. And then so on and so forth. And for powerlifting, that's usually set up, or strength lifting, that's usually set up where people train hypertrophy, work capacity, volume early, and they train heavy intensity late. In powerlifting, it's not really very powerful because nothing moves very fast. So power is not necessarily the right word, but that's kind of the idea. And there's a transition from volume to intensity, from work capacity and hypertrophy to intensity, and there's power sections in there as well. So that's the way Conjugate works. And then Concurrent is I'm going to train multiple facets at once, and that's where DUP comes in, daily undulating periodization. We'll talk about daily undulating periodization a lot more next week. But the idea there is that I'm training really all of the lifts, or certainly all of the competitive lifts that I'm trying to train, in multiple facets, usually every week, and sometimes on a literally daily basis, hence the name daily undulating periodization. So I might do all of the lifts. I might train the squat 3 times a week. Once is going to be for volume, and it might be volume via sets, or it might be volume via reps, but it's going to be volume. I'm going to do another one where it's just going to be kind of a pure strength type training, which might be like 3 sets of 5 standard. And then I'm going to do one that's really heavy, and that's going to start as a power movement. And it might be like 6 sets of 2 at 60% ish, which should be fast and explosive and perfect. And as time goes on, it's going to get heavier and heavier and heavier. And the volume's going to drop a little more and a little more and a little more. I get close to the meet, that heavy movement may just be like a top single and 2 or 3 back off singles. That might be it, right? Or maybe just a single and a back off single or 2. So DUP. So when I say in the podcast that all roads lead to DUP or block, what I'm really saying is that all roads eventually lead to concurrent or conjugate. And if you look at every advanced training program that's ever been written, and you can go to Juggernaut, you can go to Barbell Medicine, you can go to, you look at Chico, any of those people, you can apply this idea. You can look at any program they have and go, okay, well, are we training multiple facets at once? Or are we training one primary physical attribute before moving on to the next? Now, how many of you guys know, you can just raise your hand, how many of you are pretty familiar with Westside style training? I know probably everybody's heard of Westside. So Louis Simmons was the first one. Now, here's the problem. So Louis Simmons is the godfather of powerlifting. By the way, if you haven't watched Westside versus the World, you should watch it. It came out on net. It's free now on Netflix. So I bought it on iTunes, I think, the day it came out. I mean, it's crazy. I'm not telling you it's like you want to see what happens when you swing the pendulum way too far to the other end of the performance spectrum. That's Westside. You put a bunch of felons in a room with a bunch of drugs, and they all get in a competition together. Like, that's what you get. But Louis developed this program. He read a bunch of these Soviet sports reviews and these old Soviet books. And he said, okay, what I'm going to do is we're going to train really heavy once a week, or really heavy on the lower body lifts once a week and the upper body lifts once a week. And then for speed, once a week for each of those. So they train 4 times a week. So one is a lower body max effort day. One is a lower body dynamic effort day, which is speed day. Then the other day is an upper body max effort day and an upper body speed day. Well, and then Louis is like, that's conjugate. It's the Russian conjugate system. Wait a minute. What is it?
The coaches agreed that that is actually concurrent training because you are training for several different goals or physical attributes at once. You've got power and speed on one day, you've got maximum intensity, strength on the other day.
His theory there was, we're going to train for max effort strength every week, no matter what. And then we're going to train for power, for speed, another time during the week. And oh, by the way, at the end of those sessions, both of those sessions, we're going to do what's called the repetition method, which is the volume version, which is where they're going to do a bunch of volume on the accessory movements. So they did a lot of tons of back work, rows, lat pull downs, chins, all sorts of external, internal rotation stuff for their shoulders, glute ham raises, reverse hypers for the lower body. That was the big stuff there. Prowler. They were the first guys to really make the prowler popular. They took whatever the strength coach at Clemson's name is. I can't think of his name now. Who originally invented the prowler, and they started using it for power lifters. And that was their conditioning tool. So they were basically training for real heavy stuff every week, real fast stuff every week, volume stuff for hypertrophy every week, and what they called GPP, general physical preparedness, which they didn't quite have the right handle on that either, but for them it was conditioning every single week. And they did it all every week, all the time. And the way they were able to do that and make progress, outside of the fact that it was a bunch of super strong guys in a really competitive atmosphere on a whole bunch of performance enhancing drugs, and all of those things are very important for them to be able to do that, is that they rotated the exercises every week. So they didn't you can't just do a max effort day on squat and every single week come in and max out on the squat, on the main competition squat. They didn't do that at all. They would max out on the squat or the box squat or the safety squat bar squat or a good morning or a different deadlift or stuff against bands and chains, all this stuff we talked about last week. That supplemental exercise, they would actually do first on the max effort day. Now, the problem with the semantics of all this is that Louis has always called that the conjugate system, but it's not. It's concurrent training. You're training multiple facets at once. The part that is like the Russian conjugate system is that it utilizes a high rotation, a big exercise selection. So they use tons of different exercises and put them on rotation. In the beginning, what they did, the history behind this is they would do one exercise for 3 weeks in a row. So they're going to max out on the box squat 3 weeks in a row. And then they're going to rotate the exercise. And what they noticed is the first time they ever did those exercises, if you've never done a box squat or you've never done a safety squat bar good morning or something, they would actually hit new PRs all 3 weeks. And then the next time they perform those same exercises, they would only hit PRs the first week or two, and they would never hit a PR the third week. Why?
Because they were adapting to the specificity of those new exercises.
Yep. And what did we call the non-adaptation to that movement last week? What was the word we used? Novelty. So now the novelty's gone, right? And then he realized once his guys got really good at doing really all of the lifts, and there's tons of them you could do, but for most people, there's a rotation of anywhere from 6 to 12 different lifts you're putting in rotation. Once you've done those 5, 6, 7 times, there's no more novelty to it, and they just put them on a rotation and they keep trying to set PRs every time they do it. So that's how they do that. Now, that's sort of what DUP does, but DUP in and of itself, in its basic form, is a similar style of training, but without any of the supplemental movements. It's basically training the bench press, heavy once a week, or for power once a week, right? Low reps, often high sets, once a week for strength, 3 sets of 5-ish, 4 sets of 5, somewhere in there, and 1 time a week for volume, which could be something like 3 sets of 8 to 10, or it could be 10 sets of 3, whatever. It's a bunch of volume. And it often didn't include supplemental movements. And so what Westside does, And what DUP does is they do concurrent style training where they train multiple facets at once. They're like, okay, you've talked 25 minutes about this. You're beating a dead horse. What does that have to do with the taper? Well, what does it have to do with the taper? If we start to peak somebody, a client or ourselves, going into, let's say they're going to do a meet, or maybe they're just going to do a test day, or maybe they're going to do a testing week, right? If you're a coach and you have clients who don't want to actually compete yet, and they just want to test, and you're going to give everybody a testing week, or maybe you run a gym and you're like, hey, it's really good fun times to just have a testing week. This is Westminster Strength and Conditioning's testing week. We're going to test this week, and everybody's going to come in and try to set PRs, right? Okay, perfect. Although they don't do that because they run tons of meets anyway. So how might the peak, the taper, look different between conjugate training, where you're going block by block by block, versus concurrent training, where we're training all these facets at the same time?
One coach argued that with conjugate style training, the peak becomes the focus of the final block. So in other words, the goal around which the final block is organized is to display as much strength as possible on one rep. So basically maximum force production.
Could you peak out somebody on concurrent style training? Did Westside guys go to powerlifting meets and kick the shit out of everybody? Yes, or at least they did. Okay, so I would argue that the vast majority of this point of very high performing powerlifters are doing some form of DUP type training most of the year, which is essentially the new Westside. Now, again, the question still is, in general, how does that change the peak? How does that change the taper? If you're doing block training, how do you think a lifter feels 4 weeks out from a meet on block training, conjugate training? You feel terrible. You're talking them off of a ledge 4 weeks out. Because what's the second to last block in block training?
The transmutation phase, where you're ramping up the intensity while keeping a lot of the volume and just incurring a ton of fatigue.
The point is an overreach. And so my argument would be is that the taper for block is going to be longer than it will be for concurrent. It's going to require a longer taper because there's a whole bunch of fatigue there left over from this transmutation or intensification phase, same word there. And therefore, it's going to take some time to really let that fatigue dissipate and see the gains from the intensification block. Whereas concurrent, if you do it right, you are sort of living in a world that is always within 5%-ish of being peaked. So do you guys know who the big other way of training was, what the other group was, other way of training that weren't the Soviets in like the 70s and 80s that were killing everybody? The Bulgarians. And how did they train? My argument would be that they actually trained concurrent. Now you're going to be like, well, did they? It was super, super heavy all the time. And it was, well, they didn't really train their concurrent style training. Just because it's concurrent doesn't mean there have to be hypertrophy type. Doesn't have to be hypertrophy type work there. Most of those Bulgarians, not all, but most of them were kind of lighter weight guys. They were in the lighter weight classes, right? So they were like 105 kilos and below, and rarely did they even have a 105, which is a 231 pound person. So you're talking about often it was like 198 and below. Like these were all a bunch of guys who weighed between 150 and 200 pounds. Let me tell you what the Bulgarians do. They trained every single day, usually multiple times per day. So they would train a minimum of 6 days a week, and often 7, but minimum of 6. And at least 4 of those 6 days, they would train twice a day. So we're talking about like 10 plus training sessions per week. Now, here's the really freaky part. On every one of those 10 training sessions, they worked up over 90% of intensity. That's how heavy they went. Literally I'm literally talking about going over 90% on the snatch in the morning, and often going over 90% in the snatch in the afternoon on the same lift. And sometimes, and or different lifts, but it was all. And they actually had the exact opposite style training as the Soviets did. The Soviets, who used all these tons of different exercises as they were far out from a meet, and they would kind of hone in on the actual exercises that they were competing in, whether that was powerlifting or Olympic weightlifting or whatever they were doing. The Bulgarians were Olympic weightlifters. That's what they did. So the Bulgarians did snatch, clean and jerk, front squat, back squat. And what they were doing is they basically would work up on every single lift. They would do singles. So usually what they did is they would start with like hanging version. So maybe let's say they're going to do a snatch. They would do a hanging power snatch, as heavy as they could go, because they caught it above parallel. So they're going to start from the hang, and they're going to catch it above parallel, whether it's the clean or the snatch. Let's stay with the snatch. So they're going to hang snatch, add a little weight, hang snatch, add a little weight. And while they're doing the hanging snatch, they're often going to do hanging power snatch. They're often going to do sets of 3, somewhere in that ballpark. And they're going to get down to sets of 1. They're going to go heavier and heavier. And then at some point, they're going to do a hanging power snatch that's not going to be power. They're going to catch it below parallel. And then they're going to put it down, and they're going to walk away. They're going to take a couple minutes. They're going to throw a little more weight on, and they're going to start the next one from the floor. And now they're going to do a snatch from the floor, but it's still going to try to be a power snatch. And that extra movement off the floor allows them to catch the next couple singles above parallel. And then they'll get a snatch that's below parallel. Now I'm doing a full snatch. At this point, I've probably done, they would probably at maybe 30 total reps, 30 reps. And I'm talking about with warm-ups and everything ish. And then they would just start hitting singles and going heavier and heavier. And they would do full snatch singles, full snatch single, full snatch single, add a little weight, add a little weight, add a little weight, add a little weight. Miss. What happens when they missed? They sit down for 3 or 4 minutes. They get up and they do it again. Miss. Sit down for 3 or 4 minutes. Get up, do it again. Make it. Done. Make it. Rack it on their back. Walk it into the squat rack. Now there's this. It's a snatch. There's 375 pounds on the bar. There's 405 on the bar. That's where they start their squat warm-ups. Seriously. Start their squat warm-ups there. Well, they've already done overhead squats with 405 in the bottom of a snatch. And now they're either going to back squat or front squat. It just depends. And they start squatting. They do like doubles. Put a little weight on. Doubles. Put a little weight on. Doubles. Now, what those guys did was, so here's the question. Fun story to tell, but like, what does their taper look like? Now, for people who are truly world class, which those guys were, some of those guys still hold world records that were set in like 84, right? But for those guys, they had a little different taper that they would do going into the Olympics and going into the Pan Am Games, which are when the 2 years that were off the Olympics, but they still competed fairly often. What did the taper look like? If you're training in a concurrent style where you're always heavy, and the Bulgarians, rather than using volume the way we think of volume, they used what? That wasn't intensity. It was frequency. So what's their taper going to look like? It's going to reduce the frequency. How much less frequent? Not that much. They're still going to train like 6 days a week. Maybe 5, but only once a day. Because they're pussies. And then they're going to watch. But here's the point. The point is this. And by the way, none of us are that. And also, by the way, remember, the Bulgaria is a communist country at the time with literally no money. So, and this is what they would do. Government officials, the head of sport, would go to the schools, and they had a box that they would bring in, like a plyo box jump. And they would have the kids, when they were 10 years old, jump on the box. And they'd add mats to the box jump on the box, jump on the box, jump on the box. And they would identify the freaks. And if you listen, to this day, if you walk in a kindergarten classroom and you see which kid jumps on the highest box, that kid's going to have the highest vertical when he's 18. Guaranteed. They did it at 10 because 10 is still pre-puberty, right? So they did it at 10. They're like, all right, let's see who the freaks are. At 10 years old, if you were a freak, you got pulled out of your school, you got put in the sport government school, you got put in nice government housing, whatever that was in Bulgaria in 1982. Nice government housing with your family, right? And you started learning the lifts. And you did all the same lifts that the big boys did. But the weight didn't matter because you weren't in puberty yet. They're the ones that discovered, you guys have heard us all talk about like waiting until somebody gets into Tanner stage 4 to start to load their ass. Like that's the Bulgarians. That's what they did. They literally checked them. Again, communism, right? Can you imagine you're like an 8th grader and like once a month, the doctor's like, pull down your pants. Let's see what's going on. Like, all right, you're in puberty deep enough. Time to go. Load, put weight on the bar. Let's go. That's literally what they did. And it made them the best lifters in the world. Now, how many people, we don't have the stats of how many people couldn't hack that style of training. I mean, my guess is it's way in the high 90 percentile, could not hack it. But that we can learn a lot about the style of training, which is it is possible to train multiple facets at the same time and be essentially sort of ready to compete at a moment's notice, which is not really a moment's notice, but with a much faster taper than you would get with traditional conjugate or block style programming. And so if you are already lifting every single training session above 90% and often to 95 or 96 or 98% on all the main lifts multiple times per week, so your body gets used to training heavy all the time, low volume, but heavy, and very high frequency. And by the way, what did these guys do for the rest of their days? They didn't go like lay bricks. That's right. They ate food and slept and got massage. That's literally was their whole life, right? Now the question is, if you're in that level of readiness, how long of a taper do you need? Not very long, because you're there. You're already there. All we got to do is enough to dissipate fatigue. So then that leads me to say, which one's the one? It's the step taper, they call it in Elite FTS. That's the step, which is the one that they just drop the volume by like 50% overnight. Is that step, I think? That would work really well for those guys. We're just going to drop the volume by 50%. Now, how are you going to drop the volume for them by 50%? Well, you're probably going to drop the frequency by about 40% and then drop their volume, which isn't that high anyway, by 15 or 20%. And you get that kind of 50% total reduction in volume. And you do that for like 2 weeks and they're ready to go. Let's do it. Keep staying heavy. Not only keep staying heavy, probably keep going heavier. Probably actually go to 98, 99, 100, 101%, somewhere in that ballpark. And the advantage that DUP or concurrent style training gives you over block is that it's very easy to peak on short notice. Training is going well. I feel really good. I'm where I'm supposed to be. Let's drop the volume. Let's get rid of like the hypertrophy stuff for DUP. Let's hold the power stuff and some of the strength stuff. Let's let fatigue dissipate. And in like 10 days, we can taper and get into a meet and go set PRs. Now, what's the trade-off? Why wouldn't everybody just do DUP or concurrent style training? There's two primary trade-offs. One of the trade-offs is you're training all the time. And most people don't want to do that. It's a lot of training. It's high frequency training. It has to be high frequency because you're training multiple facets and you can't train multiple facets without training all of those different facets in a short period of time. Block trains all the multiple facets too. They just train multiple facets over 12 weeks. DUP trains all the multiple facets over 1 week. Now, when you train all the time, what would that potentially lead to? Some sort of problems.
For one thing, all that heavy training opens you up to injury potential.
Extremely high injury rates. Extremely high injury rates. You got to have very smart athletes and very smart coaches and excellent communication between the two to make it work. This is my problem with template-based online coaching. You're going to give these advanced lifters a program that might hurt them, that could potentially get them injured, and you're not going to be there every day to watch what they're doing and see their videos and break the thing down and see if they're getting too much fatigue. And oh man, and the problem with like really good athletes is they won't tell you that they're hurt until they're really actually no shit injured, right? Bicep tendonitis. I overextended my elbow a little bit. Oh, my triceps hurt just a little. They don't say any of that stuff. They're just like, man, my right shoulder's really hurting. I don't know what's wrong. You go in there like, oh, well, you tore your labrum. But people don't tear their labrum in lifting weights in a single session, right? Like you can tear your labrum in football or in a car wreck or if you haven't thrown a football or a baseball as hard as you can in a long time, and then you throw a ball as hard as you can tear one of your rotator cuff muscles, or you can saw a hole in your labrum in a hurry. But like that doesn't happen in weightlifting in one day. So that happens from a buildup of fatigue. So you got to be very careful with DUP or concurrent style training. The advantages are you can peak in short notice. With block training, much lower injury rates for block, much lower. And we can be very methodical about making sure that people peak and hit a PR at a specific time period. But the peak is going to take longer. It's going to be a 3 or 4 week peak, often, or taper and peak. And then the downside is with block, what if you get food poisoning the week before the meet? What if you get the flu? What if something weird happens? What if your girlfriend breaks up with you? And you just done a 12-week cycle that led to that specific day, and all of a sudden something bad happens and you can't really lift at your best that specific day. That's the problem with block. So low injury rates, more fun to do, build on each other. I always will have somebody do block before I would have them do DUP, right? It'd be very rare that I would put somebody on concurrent style training first, a strength athlete. But the downside is that you're really playing this like, I need you to be able to hit PRs on this day, period. Whereas with concurrent style training, if you get sick and you're like, oh man, I got sick, I couldn't compete at the meet, like no problem, let's look for one in 2 weeks. Let's do a meet in 2 weeks instead. And you could do that. And you can't do that with block. With block, you're like, well, we got to start a whole new 10 to 12 week block. Right? That's the downside. The most concurrent style programming there is for people who are actually good at it is CrossFit. Right? Because you actually have to be good at everything to be good at CrossFit. So while I want to be clear, I never want to train normal human beings in CrossFit because I think it's crazy and I think it's going to get them hurt. They're going to tear everything up. For years, I didn't watch it this year, and I don't remember if I watched it last year. For years, I loved watching the CrossFit games because those people are freaks. They're good at everything. They're strong, they're fast, they're conditioned, their energy systems are ridiculous, and they actually train that way, right? And one of the big arguments against CrossFit is that for a long time, this is what's kind of blown up in CrossFit's face, is that because Glassman is an egomaniacal narcissist, he thought that you could just put exercises into a hopper and just pick stuff out and be like, oh, let's be ready to do this all the time. And that the way to get ready to do that all the time is just to keep randomly doing shit. And then we realized, well, that didn't work. And then, guys like, probably not even just Froning, but like Froning was the type of guy who was just a freak. So there's always outliers. Are there people who could just do the workouts that were always posted on CrossFit.com and come in and win the CrossFit games? Yeah, like Rich Froning probably actually did that. But now that you have this sort of money behind it, these people who are winning the CrossFit games, they train. Ben Bergeron trains the F out of his people. Like it's very detailed programming. And they're doing all concurrent styled stuff. They keep them really strong, really fast, really explosive, good at gymnastics. Energy systems are super efficient, right? Now, remember, what's the downside of that? The primary downside, or the two primary downsides. You got to train all the time, all the time. All good CrossFitters. Any of you guys ever know anybody that's gone to the CrossFit games, like you actually knew the person? They train more often than the Bulgarians did. Like I've trained a bunch of them. They train 6 days a week, usually like 3 or 4 hours a day. 6 days a week. And that leads to the second problem, which is high injury rate, which is what you see all the time, right? But I will say this, as a person who prides himself in coaching and programming, I don't know that there's anybody more fun to program for than a super high-level CrossFitter, because you're still just playing with this budget, right? You've got a total budget of energy that you can use and spend and time, and you got to figure out how do I train all of these different facets at the same time so that they are recovered and peaked and ready for everything. They're kind of jack of all trades, master of none, but they're actually jack of all trades, kind of really good at all of it. They're just not the best at any of it. That's hard to get somebody there. So that's the difference between concurrent and conjugate, and the difference in how you actually peak them. The length of taper for concurrent training is going to be short. The length of taper for conjugate is going to be longer. Now that you understand the theory behind concurrent and conjugate type programming, what's the overarching goal of the peak? The goal is PRs. How do we get to PRs? Because remember that when we're in LP, we hit PRs every workout. And then we get to an HLM style 1 week Texas method-ish type program, and we're going to hit PRs every week. And then we're eventually going to get on a 4-day split, and we're going to take that 4-day split from a 1 week program to a 2 week or a 3 week or a 4 week program, and then we're going to hit PRs that often, right? Certainly 1 rep max PRs. And again, I would argue that one of the things that we're trying to do in programming is trying to hit non-1 rep max PRs all the time. The more often you can hit PRs, the better you are. Hit a new 5 rep max, hit a new 8 rep max, hit a new max at 365 for reps, whatever. Doesn't matter, right? PRs are PRs. Hey, I did 42 chin-ups this session when my best was 40. Perfect. That's a PR. Write it down. Right? Like PRs are great. But we're talking about 1 rep maxes. So a peak is for 1 rep maxes. Now, that's the goal. Question number 2. How many lifts are we trying to peak? Well, we don't know, right? It depends on the person. If they're going to a meet, it's 3 lifts. What 3 lifts? We don't know, because what kind of meet are they going to? Are they going to a powerlifting meet? We know they're going to do squat and deadlift. And then they're either going to do bench if it's powerlifting or press if it's strength lifting. Or they're going to go to a weightlifting meet and they're going to try to hit PRs on the snatch and the clean and jerk, which are different lifts. Or they're going to go to a strongman competition and they're going to do 5 events, some of which are for max heavy, as heavy as it can possibly go, like max intensity. Sometimes it's weight on the bar for reps, which is more of a muscular endurance thing, right? Some of it's athletic. The goal is PRs. Now, how do we get to the PRs?
One answer was reduce fatigue.
That's right. So if we understand SRA, then the stress in order to get to the PRs has to be higher than it ever was. If the stress is higher than it ever was for these some real, some fake people that you're doing on your assignments, at this point, they are advanced. We are into advanced programming. Therefore, the amount of stress that it took to be able to get them to PRs is going to induce a significant amount of fatigue buildup in their body, and we have to reduce that fatigue. Now, practically, how do we reduce that fatigue?
Several coaches answered, reduce volume.
Reduce volume, right? If the goal is to set PRs, like let's stick with 1 rep maxes. Let's say we're trying to set 1 rep maxes in whatever lifts, various lifts. Okay. We're going to reduce volume. Why? Why volume and not something else? Or why volume first?
One answer was that volume is the most stressful thing, so by pulling back on it, you can easily reduce stress.
Agreed. I would also argue that volume is the least specific to a 1 rep max. Okay. So it's the thing that we can reduce because of the SED principle, right? We're trying to maintain the things that are specific and get rid of the things that are not specific. So we do that by reducing volume. We can also do that by reducing frequency. I would say that's probably second in line. And the first place that I would reduce frequency, actually, does anybody know?
So one of the coaches answered the question by using the example of strength lifting. If you've got a guy peaking for a strength lifting meet, then the first thing you would do is start dropping out the bench press in order to reduce frequency.
So if the guy's not getting tested in bench press, I don't need to keep the frequency for the bench press up as I'm trying to peak for a meet that's only going to test the squat, the deadlift, and the press. Sometimes we just have a peak week and we just want our clients to hit new PRs across the board on all the lifts, right? So then that wouldn't necessarily apply. But certainly if they're only getting tested, actually, I'll give you another example. So Nikki Sims is doing right now, she's doing the USSF online meet, and she's going to hit her squat and her deadlift tomorrow. But then Saturday, she's actually in a deadlift only meet in person in San Diego. It's only for deadlifts. It's like some deadlift for charity event or something. So how much squat work do you think she's getting this week? Not very much, because I don't need to get stress from the squat because she's not getting tested in the squat, right? Now, that doesn't mean that if this was the only thing she was training for, if she was only training for the past 12 weeks for this deadlift meet, would I have her not squat for 12 straight weeks? She'd still squat, right? Don't want to detrain the squat, but also because I think the squat actually helps the deadlift. From a general standpoint, remember, as we're far out from the meet, we're going to be general. And as we get closer to the meet, we're going to get more specific. So as we get really close to the meet, potentially the last couple of weeks, I might not squat very much or at all. Now, she's going to squat right now, tomorrow, but that's the last time she's going to squat. So she's going to squat tomorrow, which is Monday. And she's going to compete on Saturday, and she's not going to squat one time between Monday and Saturday because she's not getting tested on the squat. She'll be just fine squatting just one time this week. She's advanced. She'll start back and she'll squat again next Monday. So she's going to squat on this Monday tomorrow, and she won't squat again until the following Monday. It'll be fine. She's getting tested on the deadlift, right? So we're having a peak curve for that, right? So we're going to reduce volume, and the articles talked about different ways to do that, to reduce volume.
In case you're wondering, Matt is referring to a couple of articles that he sent around about tapering and peaking for meets. One of them is from Elite FTS. One of them is on the JTS website. So if you want to check those out, go to the show notes and I'll drop links there.
You can drop volume in a hurry. You can drop volume slowly. And the lead up to that, the hour-long lead up, was that I think it depends on what style of training they're doing on how you're going to taper the person. If they've done a long 12-week-ish long program that's block style, conjugate, they're probably going to need like a 3 to 4 week taper where the intensity keeps getting heavier and the volume keeps being reduced. You could also do, like they mentioned in the article, which is you could drop the volume kind of through the floor, like 50% on the very first week of the taper, and then just hold the volume there and keep ramping up the intensity and just let fatigue dissipate over time. I think that would be fine. I'll also be honest with you guys. I've actually never done that on a conjugate style program. It's not that it wouldn't work. It probably would work just fine. I've never tested that, but it makes sense. And then if they're doing concurrent style programming, which most of your clients probably aren't, then that's where I would drop their volume through the floor for about 2 weeks and keep their intensity real high, and they're going to be ready to go. Because their body has mostly adapted to heavy and volume and frequency, all from a DUP concurrent style program. So depending on what type of programming they have, if they're kind of walking that line where they're just sort of always ready and always strong, and then they don't need very much of a taper. If they've done this thing where the intensity has slowly gone up while the volume has slowly come down, I would just keep letting the volume come down at the same sort of, 5% in reduction in volume per week and 2.5%, 3% increase in intensity per week going into the peak. It works just fine, right? So there's no magic numbers there, by the way, on what I just said. So that tends to be what I use. A lot of times I'll just increase people's intensity by 2.5% or 3% per week. That seems to be a pretty good thing to go to. And the volume would reduce by 3 to 5% per week. And then the frequency I start to pull out as they need more recovery time, right? If they don't feel fresh from session to session, then I'm going to start pulling some frequency. But you can take that too far, right? Like if they are going to compete in strength lifting, you're not going to be like, well, I'm just going to have them squat and press and deadlift once a week in order to be fresh. Like you'll detrain, right? So you're constantly walking this line. I still have to have enough stress to not detrain. Otherwise, I could take a guy like Nick, who's pretty strong, and be like, Nick, let's just take the next 2 weeks off going into the meet. Don't train at all. Fatigue would totally dissipate. You would actually probably go into the meet and you probably would feel awesome. You'd start to lift. You'd be like, ooh, everything feels heavy. So you'd walk into the meet feeling great. And then when you started actually moving the barbell, you'd be like, oof, feels heavy, right? So the intensity stays high. The volume gets drastically reduced. And the frequency usually gets reduced by a little. How much? I don't know. Depends on what they're getting tested for. If you're going to only do 3 lifts, I would drop out that 4th lift altogether the last 10 days or so. If they're going to test on all 4 lifts, I would probably reduce frequency by just a little bit, right? Maybe you're doing stuff 2 to 3 times a week. You go down to 2 times a week. You go down to whatever. You just extend the cycle from a week being 7 days to a week being 8 or 9 days, right? It takes you a little longer to get through your 4 workouts. It's another easy way to do it. Give you just an extra rest day or 2. What does a last week look like? Let's say somebody's going into a meet. The meet's on Saturday or Sunday. Say it's Saturday. What's that last week probably look like? There's not a necessarily right answer to this. There's certainly some wrong ones, but there's several ways to do this. What might that last week look like?
One coach said he would make that week light and save all the heavy lifting for the meet day.
What would be the last heavy day?
The same coach said he would make his last heavy day the last workout of the week on the week prior to the meet. So that might be like a Friday or Saturday, 1 week out from the meet. Then another coach chimed in with a little bit different approach for the deadlift. He said that he would actually pull his last heavy deadlifts for the meet 2 weeks out because he argues that it's probably going to take longer than just a week for all the fatigue from the heavy pulling to dissipate.
And I would agree with that. That's how I would do it as well. I would go pretty damn heavy on the squat and whatever pressing movement you do on Monday. And then on Wednesday, I would do some really light blood flow work. You're like, what does that mean? Well, like I would do 50% of what you think your PR is going to be, maybe 60% of what you think your PR is going to be, for usually like 3 doubles, 2 doubles, 4 singles, whatever, right? You're just trying to get moving and not get too stiff. And I don't even know if you need that day physically. I think you need that day mentally more than anything else. The weight should feel light. It should feel poppy. You should feel great. ready to go, antsy, want to lift, can't lift. Like that's what your lifter should be saying. Also, then, if I'm going to work up to an opener on Monday on the squat and either the bench or the press, my heaviest squat is going to be midweek, the week before that, Wednesday, Thursday, somewhere in there. I'm going to hit like Wednesday's perfect, real heavy squat where I'm going to hit something like 97%. I'm going to hit, 5, 10, 15 pounds under my all-time PR, like 10 days out. And usually that is the day for me that I'll hit an opener deadlift on the same day. And the heaviest deadlift I'm going to hit is exactly 2 weeks out from the meet. I'm going to hit a super heavy deadlift 2 weeks out from the meet. And after that, the opener deadlift shouldn't be that hard. So here's a guy like Nick who's super advanced, super strong. He's going to do probably something like I'm explaining where he's going to hit a really heavy deadlift 2 weeks out. He's going to hit his really heavy squat and heavy press 10 days out. And his opener deadlift probably 10 days out, somewhere in that ballpark. And then he's just going to hit his opener squat and press 5 or 6 days out. And then 3 days out, he's going to hit just some like Jane Fonda stuff. Now, how might that change for somebody like Sybil if I were going to take Sybil to a meet? And let's say, and Sybil, I'm talking about who's still an advanced athlete. Let's say it, let's not even say it's Sybil. Let's just say it's a 60-year-old female who is an advanced lifter, but she's obviously not squatting 600 pounds. She's going to squat 225. She's going to deadlift 275. How might that be different? Shorter peak. And I think you're going to hit those really heavy lifts much closer to the meet than Nick would, because of the stress that a 700-pound deadlift. Nick, you remember what it was like when you pulled 600 pounds for the first time? And you're like, holy shit, this is so heavy. And then how bad it beats you up. And then 700 is like exponentially worse from a stress standpoint. Like I don't even, guys, I can't even explain to you. Right? Same guy. So everybody recognizes that heavy, you've heard this. We've told this story on the podcast before. Ed Cohn, the guy who walks up to Ed Cohn, the greatest powerlifter of all time, after Ed Cohn deadlifts 900 pounds or whatever. And he's like, what's it feel like to deadlift 900 pounds? And Ed Cohn's like, what's your PR? He's like 405. He's like, feels about like that. Because heavy to you is heavy. Feels the same. But the aftermath of fatigue and destruction afterwards is not the same. It just isn't. So a 60-year-old lady who can deadlift 275 versus Nick who deadlifts over 700, she can probably hit her last really heavy deadlift 1 week out from the meet instead of 2 weeks out from the meet. And she can probably hit her openers for the meet on like Tuesday before the meet. She doesn't need to have that much time. So you have to think about the overall stress that those lifts are going to induce on the person and how long it's going to take to recover. That's why we can't just give you a very simple template for how to peak, because it doesn't work, because it's different for demographics. An advanced 60-year-old lady and Nick doing the exact same template, who are both still advanced, are not going to see the same results from the same template. And so we're just going to basically be like, hey, we're just going to give away for free what everybody else is trying to sell you, because we don't think it's about the program. We think it's about the system. The system is minimum effective dose changes to the programming. Figure out what's working, hone in on that, figure out what needs to be changed, make a change. You cannot do that if all you do is sell templates, right? And that's not me trying to be a dick. It's just like, I actually believe this stuff. Like, I actually believe that templates don't, that doesn't mean that you can't use a template and have it work okay. It'll work just fine. But in general, like, we actually believe in making these changes. And so we know that the peak or the taper for Nick can't be the same for anybody else that's on this call. Like, they're all going to be a little bit different. What's going to be the same for everybody is the intensity is going to keep ramping up and get heavier and heavier and heavier. Volume is going to drop, and frequency might stay the same or might get reduced a little bit. That's what a taper looks like. By the way, that's what a deload looks like too, FYI. The only difference between a deload and a taper is that in a deload, the intensity probably goes down just a little bit, and in a taper, the intensity goes up. In a deload, somebody has too much fatigue, and I need to let the fatigue dissipate, but I'm not trying to peak them yet. I'm trying to go right back into training. I'm going to deload them by reducing the volume significantly, usually by 50%. That's kind of my go-to. Doesn't mean that works for everybody. But I'm going to reduce volume by about 50% on a deload week. I'm going to reduce intensity 8 to 10%. And I'm probably going to keep frequency the same. Although if there is a specific lift that is, like if somebody's got tendonitis in a specific area, like the bench press really bothers with tendonitis, I might drop out the second bench press movement and just have them bench press once on the deload week and give their tendonitis or whatever a little break. That's what a deload week looks like. So deload week, massive reduction in volume, slight reduction in frequency. Taper, massive reduction in volume, slight reduction in frequency. The only difference between a deload and a taper for a peak is that a deload is going to have a slight reduction in intensity. And I mean slight, like just a little bit, right? 10% or less. And a taper is going to actually increase the intensity, probably 2.5%, 3% per week going into the meet. That's the only difference. And a taper is going to last, because of that intensity increase, that taper is going to last 2 or 3 or even 4 weeks. And the deload is almost always going to be just a single week deload. It will be enough to dissipate fatigue, and they can come back and train like normal the week after a deload. Deloads are another reason I don't like templates, because when I write the deload into the template, it pre-tells the person when they're going to need the deload. I've stopped doing that. I just give them a deload when they need it. As a coach, I'm coaching them every day. I can see when they need the deload, and I'll tell them a lot of times on Tuesday. Like I do programming on Sunday, so like I programmed all my clients this morning for this coming week. And I've got a couple people, and I'm like, we're going to see how this goes. Like, you've got one more week of kind of pushing. If on Monday and Tuesday, they're like, dude, I'm dying, like perfect. Die for 2 more days on Thursday and Friday, and we'll deload next week, and you'll be okay. And then sometimes they crash so hard on Monday and Tuesday, I'm like, shit, I fucked this up. I should have given them a deload this week. And so I'll start deload them on the second half of that week. And I might go ahead and deload them for the whole next week as well. Deload them for like 10 days. That's a feel thing. You got to just be able to know when there's too much fatigue present. It also requires good communication between your clients, the client, and the coach, because there's also all of those outer stresses that don't have to do with the weight room. Somebody's not eating well, somebody's not sleeping well, somebody's fighting with their spouse or their significant other, like whatever, like those things, they get job stress. Those are all things that have to be taken into account that contribute to stress. Okay, we good? Next week, what I want to talk about is accessories, and primarily how we utilize accessories. We've talked about supplemental, how we apply accessory movements from a logical, practical standpoint to M.E.D programming is what I want to talk about next week. And we'll go from there. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. See you guys.
Well, there you have it. There's another episode of the M.E.D Masterclass. Hope you enjoyed it. I hope you are ready to crush your next powerlifting meet, strength lifting meet, whatever athletic endeavors you might be training for. In the meantime, if you have any questions, go ahead and send those to questions, that's questions with an S, at barbell-logic.com. And go ahead and pull the trigger on that 5-star review you were planning to leave on iTunes. All right, I'm signing off. We will see you on Thursday.